Thank you, Maria, for that lovely introduction. Thank you, everybody, for coming today. It's very kind of you on such a beautiful afternoon to sit in a, fortunately, not too dark room and listen to a talk on art history. I'd also, of course, like to begin by congratulating the museum on the extraordinary exhibition. I had the very good fortune yesterday to see it with Sophia Jose Amorim and Maria. Thank you, Sophia, for organizing everything to get me here. And it's just extraordinary. I mean, obviously, I've seen Duchamp here and there and Jeff Koons here and there, but I think the presentation is absolutely ideal and deeply revealing in the juxtapositions of the two artists. I mean, I will not be speaking about Koons today, although maybe we can talk a bit about that in the question and answer period. So, as Maria mentioned, I've given the talk the subtitle, Desiring Machines, or the title, Desiring Machines. And I was thinking, as I'm sure everyone in this room realized, of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari's book, Anti-Oedipus of 1972, and the idea of the self, the body and the mind together as a kind of machine that functions beyond our conscious control. I mean, I think this is a very frightening idea that was already present in the works of Freud and in 19th century thinkers, that, you know, we have the illusion of consciousness, the illusion that we are the masters of our own fate, that we make our own decisions. But suppose that's not true. Suppose we are essentially machines, particularly in the matter of desire, aggression, and so forth. What if we are, in fact, largely automatic machines carrying out a program that, you know, nature has written into our DNA, and we simply have this illusion of free will? That, I think, is a critical idea for thinking about Duchamp and Picabia, perhaps also Koons. So my remarks today will take the form of a spiraling inwards, and I hope it won't seem too repetitious. I'm going to go over the same material, in effect, 3 times. First, by telling you, by speaking about in effect, the textbook story. Let's see. Yes, here we go, the textbook story. When I teach a class for undergraduates at the university in New York, what do I tell them about Duchamp and Picabia? You know, what are the essentials that they need to know? But also, to some extent, a cleaned up story. I don't know if there's a Spanish word for this, but in English we say Baudelarized. Baudelaire was an editor in the 19th century who went through English literature and took out all of the sexy bits and only left the clean parts. So to some extent, I think the official history of Duchamp and Picabia is a little Baudelarized. But it's essential to know that. And in some ways, that Baudelarized history probably is the most important history. So I want to start with that. And then I'm going to come back through their work, particularly their early work, and talk about the hidden sexual subtext. I'm sorry, this will be very Freudian. I suppose I should be giving this talk in Buenos Aires, where everyone in the room would be in psychoanalysis, right? But in any case, I want to talk about the sexual subtext of their more famous works. And then finally, on the third turn of the spiral, I want to focus in on the ready-mades and discuss how the sexual subtext of other works may actually suggest a new way of thinking about the ready-mades. So to start with the textbook story, here on the right, of course, is a work you're all familiar with, Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase of 1912. And I simply wanted to put in a reminder, because as Maria mentioned, I do a lot of work on Picasso, of how much Cubism was truly an invention of Picasso and Georges Braque as this new language of geometric forms, but also this strange world, oddly like Rembrandt, of browns and grays and, lightness coming out of darkness and a strange kind of metaphysical universe. So this is something that Picasso and Braque had started creating, let's call it in the summer of 1910. Obviously, there's earlier Cubism, but this particular kind starts then. And what Duchamp did in Nude Descending a Staircase was to set the Cubism of Picasso and Braque into motion. Not just with the title of Descending a Staircase, but with the repetition of forms. As you can see, we see each leg multiple times, we see the arms multiple times, the body multiple times. And here, as I think is well known, I'm sure you all know this already, he was influenced by the chrono photographs of Etienne Jules Marey, who was a scientist, a researcher of the 1880s and 1890s, and who took photographs with lines, repeated motions that were influenced not only Duchamp, but also the Italian futurists like Giacomo Balla and Boccioni and so forth. So this was a tremendous breakthrough, and one can easily imagine Duchamp having remained a cubist, like Albert Glaise or Jean Messanguet or the other salon cubists. And indeed, he was quite close to them. He was part of their circle at this moment. And part of what makes it surprising that he did not remain a cubist is that he was incredibly successful with this work, particularly when it came to New York. In 1913, there was this big show of modern art in New York called the Armory Show, which, by now is kind of a classic, but I'm going to make a small digression here. This was the idea of a few American artists who were members of what was, for better or for worse, the American avant-garde. And you have to think back to the days when the United States was very much a provincial country that, didn't really know what was going on. So there were these artists in New York who thought, we should do a show of our avant-garde art. And one of them thought, gee, do you think they have avant-garde art in Europe too? We should find out. So one of them went to Paris and, wow, they did have avant-garde art in Europe. So they brought quite a lot of it back and put it in the Armory Show. And of course, this very sad thing for the New York artists was that there was much more news, much more excitement about the French and German artists than about the American artists. The American artists sort of got forgotten in all the publicity. But probably the work that aroused the most excitement at the Armory Show was Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase. There was a tremendous amount written about it. Everybody wanted to see it. It really overshadowed. There were works by Picasso and Braque. They didn't get much attention. Duchamp was the absolute star of this exhibition. And he even provoked the newspaper cartoon that you see on the left, which is a kind of pun, at least in English, the rude descending a staircase instead of the nude descending a staircase. And if one lives in New York City, one immediately recognizes this as the subway, the metro at rush hour. And these are the vast crowds of people jamming their way down the stairs to try to get to the trains. So, this is a joke. And yet it's a joke that I think speaks to a deep truth, which is that Duchamp's painting very much evokes a truth of modern life, that modern life is broken up, that it's crowded, that you can't get a grip on it, that we ourselves are buffeted about like the planes in a Cubist painting or like the planes in Duchamp's painting. So again, Duchamp, really a successful Cubist. We could have just stopped there. But he didn't. And one of the strange things that he did when he decided that he was not satisfied to be a Cubist, and let me interject here something Maria and Sophia and I were talking about yesterday, Duchamp's famous remark that he didn't want to be just a retinal painter. So what is a retinal painter? Well, it's essentially an impressionist. This is the theory of Impressionism. Don't paint what you know. Yes, I know that's a bookcase over there, but I'm not going to draw it or paint it the way I know a bookcase is. I'm going to do lots of little white strokes for the spines of the books and some blue strokes for the ones that have blue leather covers. and it'll be just sort of a jumble, a kind of abstract jumble of blue and white, and that will be, a beautiful painting, and it will be, and it is. Not mine, but yours, perhaps. So Duchamp was rejecting this idea of an art that didn't involve thinking, that did not make a statement about the world, that had no intelligence behind it, that could be done in a seemingly mechanical way. But let's be aware that his cubism was not retinal painting. What he gave up, what he rejected, was something that was already much more intellectual, much more meaningful than merely retinal painting. Nonetheless, he pushes that aside, and he makes the work that you see on the left, the chocolate grinder. I'm skipping over any number of things that come in between, which is a very odd little painting. I mean, it's this strange device, and here, there's a story there isn't time to tell about the history of modern chocolate. I mean, chocolate comes from here. I should have thought of that sooner. But, the chocolate bar as we experience it today, or chocolate candy, was only invented in the late 19th century. And it required a new technology of grinding chocolate very fine, putting it into a paste with the fats and so forth. So this machine is speaking to something new, to a new taste for a kind of candy and sugar that you wouldn't have found in the 18th century or even the early 19th century. But why make a painting of it? And furthermore, the lighting of this painting is very peculiar. It's very dramatic. There seems to be a brilliant light coming from your side, the right, projecting almost sideways on the chocolate grinder and casting these very long, dramatic shadows. Here, I think we have to see the influence of Giorgio de Chirico, the creator of metaphysical painting. And that in effect, Duchamp is saying, there is something strange, there's something deep and philosophical and metaphysical about this seemingly ordinary mechanical object, the chocolate grinder. So here's a question I'm going to leave in the air for the moment. Why all this fuss about this machine? And then from here, he begins work on the very large double painting on glass, The Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelors, even, also just for simplicity's sake, known as The Large Glass. And in the exhibition, this is very beautifully represented by a screen on which there's projected or digitally reproduced the image that you see here on your right. But as I imagine you know, in fact, this is, as the name suggests, a painting on glass. It's transparent. I'm showing it here the way it's shown in the exhibition with a white background because it's easier to see the imagery, and I will be coming back to this imagery in some detail later. But in fact, when you see it in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, you see right through it. It's actually somewhat difficult to see the images because you see the room, you see people behind it. There have been a series of performances, famously in the 1970s. Hannah Wilke did a nude performance behind it recently. There were a series of performances as part of an exhibition called Dancing Around the Brides. So this is an important feature that I'm not going to say another word about today, different lecture. Well, this is a very large, strange painting that Duchamp kept working on bit by bit for 8 years, from 1915 to 1923. At one point, when it was being shipped somewhere, it bounced around in a truck, it got cracked, and it was like, oh my God, I'm going to do it again. Then I thought, no, it's actually better with the cracks. I'm not really sure whether he really thought it was better or he just could not face the idea of doing it. It's very meticulous because it's not painted with a brush. It's done with metal. It's like a piece of beautiful craftsmanship with wires and metal inserted into the glass. It's extraordinary. And meanwhile, while he's working on this very strange sort of painting, he has the idea of making these new objects, the ready-mades. And here is, I think, the first one, the bicycle wheel on the left. And what do these mean? I mean, where does he get this idea? I would guess, because as a Picasso scholar, I think everything goes back to Picasso, that this must have been inspired by the practice of collage and papier-collé, of taking little bits of the real world and sticking them into pictures. But Duchamp, at this moment, takes an enormous leap beyond Picasso, beyond Braque, and says, well, why bother with the picture? Why not just take the real object and make that the work of art? And here, I think, is the enormous power of the philosophical gesture. Philosophical isn't the right word, but I can't think of a better one. The idea that simply by the act of assertion, the will of the artist, and now we're going a little Nietzsche on the will of the artist, you can make something into a work of art. I mean, I could take out this pen and say, this is a work of art. That doesn't actually work. I mean, I'm not an artist, so the magic doesn't happen. And I mean, this raises some very deep questions that there isn't time to go into. What is the magic that allows some people, like Marcel Duchamp, to say this is a work of art, and to make, and then it becomes a work of art, and other people like me, it just sits there and it's still just a pen. So this, I think, probably is the single most important thing Marcel Duchamp ever did, and that idea of the artist's will, the artist's assertion, is his most revolutionary legacy to modern and contemporary art. Just to give you one example, obviously there could be hundreds, thousands of examples. Here, for instance, is one of Dan Flavin's great works of minimal art, as is actually the first of his pure works of fluorescent tubing, the Diagonal of May 1963, where he went to a hardware store and he bought a lighting fixture and he put it on the wall and he said, this is my work of art. That's all. There's no transformation. It's not part of something. He'd earlier been using lights as part of something, but the radical moment in Flavin's career is when he says, I don't need the rest of it. I'm going to use the light bulb and the fixture. I mean, that is amazing, and obviously something that would not have happened without Marcel Duchamp. And it's not that people were unaware of this in the 1960s. As you may know, the very phrase minimal art was not what people called the movement at the beginning. There were a number of, no one could figure out what to call it. There was literal art, ABC art, unitary forms, specific objects. So how did it come to be called minimal art? The British philosopher Richard Wollheim published an essay in Art News, I think in 1967, called Minimal Art, and everyone went, that's it. That's the phrase we want. So you might imagine that the essay was about Dan Flavin and Donald Judd and Robert Morris. It's not. The essay is about Marcel Duchamp. And what Wollheim meant by minimal, he poses the question in this wonderful, wonderful essay: what is the least amount of work an artist can do and still have the product be a work of art? You know, what is the minimal effort? And he ultimately says, this act of selection, picking it out and saying this is a work of art, that alone is enough to make something a work of art. So there, and then the name gets applied to Flavin and Judd and so on and so forth. So here, I think, is the greatest part of Duchamp's legacy. And okay, so I'll stop here. No, sorry, I'm going to be coming back to this from another direction. But I do want to go back and talk about Picabia, who was very much Duchamp's, I don't know what the Spanish phrase is, but we say in English, partner in crime. They were accomplices in the making of French Dada. And like Duchamp, Picabia begins, at first he's an Impressionist phase and so forth, but he's profoundly influenced by Picasso. And I'm showing you, to illustrate that here on the right, Picabia's Dance at the Spring of 1912. There are actually 3 different versions of this painting. And then on the left, Picasso's Three Women of 1908. This is a painting that is not emphasized enough in the literature on Cubism, the Picasso. because it was sold to Sergei Shukin and disappeared into Russia in 1913 and was not seen again really until sometime in the 1970s. So it was kind of forgotten for a long time. I think it's really important. I put it on the cover of my book, and I've noticed a number of Cubism books since then where other people put it on the cover, and I think, yes, score. In any case, it was a hugely influential painting. During the 5 years it was in Paris, it was owned by Gertrude Stein and her brother Leo, and it hung in their salon where, as you know, every artist, not only every artist in Paris, but every artist who visited Paris came to the Steins' house. And so Picabia and dozens or hundreds of other artists saw the three women there in Paris before it left. And so paintings like this one were, in effect, the result. So Picabia, like Duchamp, shows in the Armory show. He comes to New York in 1913. He gets a lot of admiration and recognition, not quite as much as Duchamp, although he went. I don't think Duchamp came to New York in 1913, so Picabia gets to be sort of a star. As you know, an actual living, breathing cubist, you can reach out and pinch him. But then he comes back again in 1915, and he has this new idea while he's visiting there in New York, and he's gotten to be friends with Alfred Stieglitz, who, as you know, was a great photographer, but also owned a very important gallery, the Gallery 291, called 291 because it was at 291 Fifth Avenue. And this was a gathering place for the New York avant-garde. It wasn't just a photo gallery or even gallery in general. And so Picabia starts doing these drawings, like the two you see here. On the left is one that's a tribute to Stieglitz. This is Stieglitz' Faith and Love. And this is the kind of camera that Stieglitz himself worked with, an old-fashioned camera with a bellows. There is something very strange about this drawing, however, which is that the front of the camera has been pulled so far away from the back using that kind of pentagram, the metal pieces, that the bellows have broken away. It's a kind of allegory of someone who's reached so far into the future that he's lost touch with the past. It's not just a camera, it's a broken camera. It's a kind of over-ambitious camera. So it's a very complicated allegory. And then on the right is another portrait, this one dedicated to Marius de Zayas, who was indeed Mexican, but who had gone to New York, and he was incredibly talented painter, cartoonist, critic, writer, gallerist. He worked at the Gallery 291 with Stieglitz. At some point he realized that Stieglitz, who was very rich, had no particular interest in selling art. So de Zayas opened up his own gallery, the Modern Gallery, and actually sold art, which is a good thing to do. And when Stieglitz wanted to do the first show of Picasso's work in New York in 1911, he sent, Edward Steichen was already in Paris and sort of told Stieglitz that they should, do something about Picasso. But de Zayas was the one who went to Paris and made contact with Picasso, since they could both speak Spanish, and, helped choose the exhibition and brought it back to New York. So de Zayas is a really important figure. Well, this is a very strange and confusing image. And incidentally, in just the few days since I put together this PowerPoint, I've realized that the translation of the subtitle is not really correct. Obviously, it's in French, de Zayas, je suis venu sur les, I can't quite read it here, je suis venu sur les rivages du Pont Euxin, which I've translated on screen as I've come to the banks of Pont Euxin. But of course, Pont Euxin doesn't mean anything in English. It actually means the Black Sea. He's saying, I've come to the shores of the Black Sea. And so this is a reference to Xenophon's Anabasis about the Greek army that was going to invade Persia. Donald Trump before Donald Trump? I hope not. So then they get into trouble and they have to fight their way back to the Hellenic, the Greek cities on the shores of the Mediterranean. So this is a moment of they've finally reached safety. They've come to the shores of the Black Sea. I have no idea what this has to do with Marius de Zayas. I'm not sure anyone has figured it out yet. But in any case, you can see that this phrase is attached, those are little brown waves underneath, to this complicated diagram, and I'm going to come back to the diagram in a few minutes. So this kind of diagram, where does this come from? Well, again, it comes from Picasso and Braque, and from the very spare style that we usually call synthetic cubism that Picasso and Braque had introduced in 1912. I'm showing you an example on the left of a violin, a drawing of a violin that Picasso did in the fall of 1912. This is not a randomly chosen example. This particular drawing had recently been exhibited in Stieglitz's gallery. It had gone to the United States, so Picabia would have seen it there in New York, and it's now in the collection of the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So I think that this very spare kind of grid of vertical lines, horizontal lines, a lot of white paper, this is something that Picabia was thinking of in terms of Cubism. But this is sort of his farewell to Cubism, and he's initiating here something that's tremendously important, which is what we call the machine style of the later 1910s and the 1920s. And to give you just one example, here is a photograph by Paul Strand, a brilliant young photographer who, again, was part of Stieglitz's circle, part of the 291 group, who in 1917, beginning around this time, makes pictures like this one, Wheel Organization. So this seems very familiar to us now, the idea that you can look at machinery and find a kind of beauty in machinery that you might not have suspected. You might have thought, well, machinery, it's just useful, but no, Picabia said, and Strand said, and lots of other artists, no, it's actually beautiful. And if you look at it carefully, you'll see the beauty in it. So this here is where, just to recap this part one, the conventional story. We go from the ready-made, as the assertion of the artist's will, to minimal art of the 1960s and later. And in a shorter time frame, we go from Picabia's machine drawings of 1915 from the machine drawings to the machine art, photographs, sculptures, paintings. This becomes a very important part of modern art in the 1920s. But now I want to move on to the second topic. And I just want to make sure that we do have a young person in the room. Okay, well, just cover her eyes when I get to the dirty bits. I don't think there's any Jeff Koons in here, so we'll probably be okay. I'm exaggerating slightly for dramatic effect. Okay, so here I want to pick up on the themes of sex and a kind of desecration in the work of Duchamp and Picabia. So on the left, famously, the postcard or poster on which Duchamp drew a mustache and a goatee on the Mona Lisa and gave it this seemingly innocuous caption, L-H-O-O-Q, but of course, if you say that in French, L-H-O-O-Q, it means she has a hot ass, so it's, is sexual innuendo. And on the right, Picabia's Holy Virgin, which of course is a kind of deliberate blasphemy. It's taking, the ultimate image of purity, the Immaculate Conception, everything we associate with the Virgin Mary, and saying, no, it's just a dirty spot. It's a mess. It's a stain. I mean, this is, being as, for a good Catholic like Picabia, or a bad Catholic like Picabia, this is as blasphemous as he could possibly get. And where do they go with this? This becomes an important theme in their later work, which is a little bit after the canonical work. So by the late 1920s and the 30s, we find Picabia making these paintings where he takes nudes from sort of soft-core pornographic magazines. There used to be this wonderful genre. I actually remember buying some of these when I was in Paris in the university, of artist studies, which were these, big books with black and white photographs of tastefully posed nude women. And I'm sure that they were only purchased by artists who wanted to use them as sources for paintings. None of them were purchased by teenage boys like myself. So this is the kind of source that Picabia is using, but he's putting image upon image, layer upon layer, in a way that I think for a long time, these paintings were just felt to be kind of embarrassing and stupid, and gee, it's really terrible. He used to be such a great artist. What happened to Picabia? But since the 1980s, they've been re-evaluated, and we've seen, for instance, that they seem to lead up to the work of David Salle and postmodernism in the 1980s, layering images of various kinds. And of course, there are other examples. Maria just showed me yesterday a painting by André Masson, which is based on Courbet's Origine du Monde, which is in turn apparently a source for the big Jeff Koons of the Origine du Monde that's in the exhibition. So this is where Picabia goes, and I think one has to raise the question, well, if he becomes such a sex maniac later, if so much of his later work is concerned with sex and pornography, should we be looking for something else in his earlier work as well? And then, of course, there's this famous last work of Duchamp that he worked on for so many years in secrecy, the Étant Donné, which he worked on for 20 years. From 1946 to 1966, he claimed to have stopped making art. He said, all I want to do is play chess. You know, I want to be a grand master, which he almost became. You know, he supported himself essentially by working as a private dealer in art. He had a fantastic eye. He helped form any number of great collections in the United States. But it turned out that for 20 years, he was working on this very strange installation where you go up to this door in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and it's very odd. It doesn't match any of the other doors in the museum, but it doesn't have a label, and that's intentional. There is no label on this work of art. There's nothing to tell you that it is a work of art. And you go up to this door, and if you stare at it for a while, you'll notice that there's a hole or two holes, and if you peer through the holes, you see this very strange scene of a nude woman lying on the ground, exposing her privates to the viewer, but holding a lamp, and there's a waterfall in the background, so there's all this kind of mystical symbolism. Well, okay, there's all this mystical symbolism, but still, we're looking at the crotch of a naked woman, so, it's a dirty image in a sense. Both mystical and sexual, and the fact that she's, lying on the ground in the grass is very disturbing. It suggests that there may have been a sexual assault. I mean, this is not a light image. It is a very disturbing image. So that's where this goes. Now, I want to go back now and look at the earlier work of Picabia and Duchamp and see if we can pick out anticipations of this. So going back to Picabia for starters, let's look again at this work about desires. Here on the left is the actual diagram that it's based on. I wish I could take credit for discovering this, but I can't. There's a wonderful professor in Texas, at least I hope he's still alive and with us, named William Campfield, who's, I think, the greatest scholar of Picabia. And he discovered many years ago that Picabia had picked out the diagram that you see on the left here from a book about automobiles. This is from the day I have since, following in Campfield's footsteps, actually gotten a hold of a copy of this book. And because I wanted to make a good scan of the diagram, though I'm afraid this might be the one from Campfield. This is from the days when automobiles were mostly luxury objects. And if you had one, you sort of had to know how it worked because it was probably going to break all the time. So it was useful to be able to repair it or understand what was wrong with it. So it's 300 pages of information about how different cars are made and how this is connected to that and so forth. It's kind of weirdly fascinating. But in this case, we're seeing the illustration of the wiring diagram for the starting system and the lighting system. And in the real diagram on the left, there's a big battery at upper left, a big car battery, and you notice that car batteries haven't changed that much. Maybe the ones in Teslas look different. I don't know. I haven't looked under the hood of a Tesla. But in a regular car, they still look pretty much the same. And there's wires that go from that to the starter mechanism for the engine, which you see in the lower left, and then to the dashboard. And then they're connected to the headlights, which are what you see at the bottom, those oval-shaped things. And there's the horn, I think, is at the top, and so forth. So this is where all the wires go with the electricity. Well, what has Picabia done with this? I mean, he's cleaned it up, he's simplified it a bit, but the most important thing he's done with it is to take out the battery and replace it with a corset, with this garment for a woman, which is a corset that is intended to, prop up her breasts and squeeze in her waist and, shape her hips and so forth. So this is a garment to wear to make yourself look sexy. But of course, it's a very strange thing because it's like the ghost of a sexy woman. It's the model of a certain sexual stereotype of beauty without the actual woman, but still very sexual. And this becomes the battery. It's the energy from I see I've chased away the younger people, oh dear. This becomes the battery that powers everything else. So there is a kind of moral here of sexual desire, sexual excitement is what powers everything, what powers the automobile, what powers the man, perhaps the world in general. And then we get even more obvious direct metaphors in works like this one on the left, Machine Turned Quickly from 1916-17, which at first looks very much like a blueprint for some kind of machine. There's a big gear and a little gear. It's white on blue. This was the photo technology for reproducing diagrams for buildings and machinery. But if you look carefully, you'll see in the lower left-hand corner that it's numbered, and I always get this wrong. 1 is the woman and 2 is the man. We don't actually know which one is turning the other. I imagine that the larger gear is turning the smaller gear, and he's saying, turn faster, turn faster. So here, obviously, we have a different kind of allegory of sexual intercourse. And so this image, as well as the general machine style, is extremely influential. We find almost a copy of it, for instance, in one of Man Ray's photograms, Dancer from 1920, with the superimposed gears. And so the implication, I think, is not merely that Man Ray's Dancer is dancing, that she's moving, and here we could think back to the nude descending a staircase, futurism, the idea of evoking motion in a still image, but specifically that her movement is sexual, that it's arousing, that dance stands in here for sex. And of course, there's a connection, dance is often sexually arousing. But what about Duchamp? And here I want to circle back to this very important painting, actually one of a group of paintings, but I'm just going to stick to this one, called The Bride of 1912. And as you can see, this seems to have a great deal of mechanical imagery in it. There are tubes at lower left. There's a kind of a gear. Things are attached to the gears. There are all these wires. So it's kind of mechanical, but what kind of machine in particular is it? And my suggestion is that it is a bicycle. And if you look at the gear, think about the gear in a bicycle, think about the controls on a bicycle, which have tubes with wires running through them. And even those narrow tubes that you see running through much of the picture are rather like the steel tubes in a bicycle frame. And here I would remind you that the bicycle in 1912 was not a brand new kind of object, but one that still was very much a symbol of modernity. Bicycles, as we know them, I think are perfected in the mid-1880s, the safety bicycle. There had been earlier bicycles that were made with wood frames or cast iron frames and solid wheels. Can you imagine riding a bicycle with solid wheels and a cast iron frame? Bumpity, bumpity, bump, you would not have any teeth left when you finished. So the bicycle as we know it is a combination of several different inventions. To begin with, the steel tube, which made it possible to make a lightweight frame that was very strong because it's tubular, but light because it's hollow. And in the early era of modernism, this was very much a symbol of modernity. If you think about Bauhaus furniture, the chairs that were designed by Breuer and so forth, or Corbusier's chairs with those steel tubes holding leather cushions, those are bicycle tubes. I mean, literally, the furniture made at the Bauhaus, they bought the tubes at a bicycle factory not far from the Bauhaus. So the steel tubes. Pneumatic tires, the reason your teeth don't fall out. That was a new invention. Now we think of pneumatic tires in relation to automobiles, but in fact they were first used for bicycles because they cushion the impact that, as you go over bumps. The wire frame, the wires that hold the wheels together, all kinds of things. So bicycles gave people an amazing kind of liberation. You could travel much faster on a bicycle. There's a kind of progression in the modern world from the bicycle to the motorcycle to the automobile, and this corresponds to economic progress. In the late 19th century, and the 20th century, bicycles made it possible to go to work at a factory a long way from where you live. Think about the De Sica film, The Bicycle Thief. When he loses his bicycle, he's going to lose his job, and that's in 1945. So that kind of awareness of what a bicycle meant, I think, was in Duchamp's mind. Then as you climb up the ladder, you get a little more money, you can afford a motorbike, and finally, if you're lucky, you can afford an automobile. But there's also another side to the bicycle, which is the action of riding the bicycle. Now we're back to Picabia and his machines. And Picabia, we know what Picabia thought of the image of the bride because he made his own version. Just as he made his own version of the LHOQ, where he wanted to reproduce it, and Duchamp said, just do it again. So he drew his own mustache on the Mona Lisa. He made his own version of the bride, the novia here, which is even more clearly a bicycle. But conversely, the implication is that the man riding the bicycle, yes, I think the children have gone. The man riding the bicycle is like a man riding his wife, that, the act of intercourse. You take my meaning here. I could go into detail, but I won't. So this was very much on the minds, I think, of both Picabia and Duchamp, that the machine is not just a neutral machine, it's a very sexualized machine. Which brings us back finally to the bride stripped bare by her bachelors even, and here, again, this is not an original interpretation. I'm just giving you the standard interpretation here. In the upper part, the top pane of glass, we see the bride, who is herself a kind of machine, or a desiring machine, or a desired machine. And the lower part on the left, we see these very strange cylindrical forms who are the bachelors. And they, as we are told in Duchamp's notes, in effect are lusting after the bride, but none of them can reach her. There's no, you would think if this were a fairy tale, there would be the 9 suitors, and one of them is the lucky prince who finally gets to marry the princess. Not in this picture, that's a different movie. In this one, nobody wins. And apparently, I'm not an expert on this, but apparently that strange shape at the top has something to do with the princess, the bride, having an orgasm all by herself. Very strangely shaped orgasm, but who knows. Meanwhile, what about the bachelors? What do they do? Well, as Duchamp more or less put it, they grind their chocolate. You'll notice that on the lower right hand, there is the chocolate grinder that we saw a few minutes ago. So the chocolate grinding machinery goes round, and they have to find satisfaction by themselves, which is, I guess, the next best thing. Obviously, there are other elements here that I'm not going to go into, but I do want to pause and look a little more closely at these poor bachelors and show you on the right a drawing, one of the preparatory studies. There's a series. We start with early realistic drawings that you see on the upper right here, and then go to the abstract drawings like the one on the lower right, and then there's an intermediate phase of a work on metal on glass called the 9 Malick molds, which is a study for the lower left side of the large glass. But just to pick out these 2 examples, at the lower right, we have something called the Cemetery of Uniforms and Liveries. And that seems to me very important, the title here. It's not yet the Malick molds. It's now something much more human. These are coats. These are the kind of coats that were worn in the days when lots of people were servants. The days that are mostly happily behind us, when a very large percentage of the population in every country was, if they were lucky enough to have a job and not be a peasant working in the dirt somewhere, the best they could hope for was to be a servant for some rich, noble, powerful person. And this seems to have been on Duchamp's mind. The drawing on the top right, as you can see, is a funeral coachman. That's from 1904, 1905, well before Nude Descending a Staircase. So Duchamp seems to have noticed the pathos of being a servant, the way that the clothing marks out your identity. You are the coat you wear. You are nothing more than that. I don't know if Duchamp was thinking of Russian literature, but these images remind me of two stories by Gogol, the great Russian writer. The Overcoat, about a man whose identity in the Russian civil service depends on his coat. And another story, The Nose, where a man's nose detaches itself, and the nose makes a wonderful career in the Russian administration, while the man is a complete failure. So there's this sense of dehumanization. And in Duchamp's writing, when the uniforms and liveries become the Malick molds, he explains that the man, on one hand, expands to fill the coat, but on the other hand, is shaped by it. Like the character in Gogol, the men are nothing more than the uniforms they wear. They have been dehumanized. And I think that this adds a new level of social criticism and consciousness to the bride stripped bare by the bachelors, that it's not just that the bachelors happen to be a bunch of losers who can't find a wife, but they are, in fact, men who have been demasculinized, emasculated by their social roles in society, that this points us to an awareness of class difference and discrimination in modern, and not just modern, in traditional society. So that's part of this image. So now I want to try, in this third part, to bring this back to the question of the ready-made in particular. What we were just looking at, interpreting the bride and the bachelors, is a visual image. It's an unusual kind of two-dimensional image, but it's still very much an image like a painting. These, of course, are the radical new objects that Duchamp has created. So this is a photograph from a photograph of Duchamp's studio. I imagine it was taken by Duchamp himself. Sometime in 1917, 18, he reproduces this photograph that's hand-colored in the Boîte en Valise on that miniature reproduction of his entire oeuvre from 1935. So we see his bed, his reading chair, and then two of the ready-mades, the bicycle wheel on the left mounted on a stool, and then on the floor, the work known in English as trap, I think it's trébuchet in French, which is a coat rack. It's something meant to hang, you hang your coat on the lower hook and then you put your hat on, so it's not just a coat rack, but you put your hat on the upper part, from the days when men, you didn't go out the front door without wearing a hat. Everyone wore hats. When did hats come to an end? 1960, when John F. Kennedy was elected president. He was the first important public figure not to wear a hat in public, and hat sales fell by something like 50% after his election. So the hat and coat, but on the floor. Why are they on the floor? I mean, it's nailed to the floor. He didn't just leave it there. He actually nailed it to the floor, where it becomes a menace. This is why it's called trap, because someone who walks in the studio and isn't paying attention could easily trip over it. So that's one image of these objects in his studio. I'm getting ahead of myself in the notes. Okay, so then the trap is on the floor, those little curvy things. There's his chair and his bed. I'm sorry. I'm just going to replay the last 5 minutes. So here again, this raises the question, now that we've seen Picabia's interpretation of the bride and the bicycle, what exactly should we make of the bicycle wheel as a ready-made? I mean, we know that Picabia, that Duchamp liked to sit next to it. I mean, presumably in that chair, it could move. It was not nailed to the floor. And he would kind of idly spin it while he was just sitting there. So what are we to make of this gesture of sitting in a chair, spinning a wheel? Perfectly innocent, I'm sure, or not. Well, obviously, Picabia would have suggested that there was something not innocent about it, that this is, in fact, a sexualized gesture, that the bicycle wheel has a allegory or a symbolism in it. And here, something I should have said earlier when I introduced the ready-mades the first time, there are different layers of interpretation of these things. When Duchamp exhibits his fountain, which is he doesn't even take credit for in the beginning, the urinal, there's a whole discussion about what it means. Is it beautiful? Is it obscene? Is it outrageous? Then discussion dies down for a while because you have to remember that things like the ready-made were not exhibited publicly. The only ready-made exhibited publicly for decades and decades was fountain. Then when they begin to be reproduced in the 1950s and again in the 1960s by Arturo Schwartz, and just to note that the versions you're seeing in the exhibition here are from the 1964 Arturo Schwartz edition, which is the good edition. It's the one where Duchamp worked with Schwartz to make everything as accurate as possible. There are other examples. There are replicas of the ready-mades from the 1950s, which someone else made them, and Duchamp said, sure, yeah, fine. But, for instance, the Museum of Modern Art owns a version of the bicycle wheel that's curved, which is not like the one on the left. The one you will see in the exhibition, or you have seen, is the one with the straight fork, where they got it right. So in this later phase, where Duchamp begins to show the ready-mades publicly and authorizes their reproduction, he also begins to discuss them. And famously, in a panel at the Museum of Modern Art in 1956 or so, he's asked, how did you choose these? Alfred Barr, the founder of the Museum of Modern Art, says, so Marcel, how did you choose these things? And Duchamp famously says, well, I would make an appointment. I'd take out my diary and I'd make an appointment with myself to go to the hardware store. And on the chosen day and time, I would go to the hardware store and then I'd pick out an object. And Barr said, well, okay, how did you decide which object? And Duchamp said, well, I tried to find one towards which I would remain perfectly indifferent. At which point Barr burst out and said, but Marcel, they're so beautiful. And Duchamp said, nobody's perfect. But I think we have to question this assertion. I mean, remember, this is a statement from the 1950s. Is that in fact what Duchamp was thinking in 1913 and 1915 and 1917? There's no proof that it is. And my argument would be that indeed he did not pick objects to which he was indifferent, that we can't always figure out why he chose a particular object. As we were discussing yesterday, in advance of the broken arm, the snow shovel, I really have no idea why he chose that one. But I feel reasonably certain that the bicycle wheel was chosen because it was a bicycle wheel, because it had this symbolism attached to it, which he had already explored in his painting of the bride. That there's the connection here is he's thinking about the bicycle as a mechanism equivalent to a human being, even specifically a sexual mechanism, and then he thinks, why not just take the wheel? Why not invoke this allegory of activity or even sexual activity and just have the object itself? So that, I think, is what is going on here. And then here's another one, the bottle rack of 1914. There's one in the show. You see, I think, a different edition perhaps on the right here, and I hope this is actually on screen. So I just want to remind you of how these things actually work. So I went on the internet and I found a photograph of a bottle rack in use. And of course, it has all these bottles. Let me find one that's not open, turned upside down with little prongs inside them. Does this make you think of anything? Yes, I thought it might. Indeed. So my guess is that we are once again looking at a sexual allegory here, and even a kind of wild fantasy of a kind of orgy of many, many prongs and many, many bottles having a wonderful time together. I mean, I hope they're having a wonderful time. It might be argued that there is something, cruel and sadistic looking about the bottle rack, and maybe there's a kind of, element of sadomasochism or just sadism in here, and that's another lecture. But in any case, the precise associations, I think, could be, argued about, but I think that there is something sexual going on, seems to me quite likely. Now, what about the hat rack? And here's a photograph of the original hat rack on your left, and yes, thank goodness, it's on screen. And you can see it is suspended from the ceiling, and it is displayed that way happily in the exhibition, just hanging in the air above your head. You can tell from the photograph, I'm sorry, it's a very faint photograph again. Oh no, this one is not, I think, from the Bottom Valise. That so are the other objects. At the upper left of this photograph is the shovel part of In Advance of the Broken Arm. So the stick, is evidently attached to the ceiling somewhere. And then we see in the mirror, and I don't think it's a coincidence that Duchamp has taken this photograph looking into a mirror, we see this very strange white object at the upper right edge of the mirror, which is the underside of the fountain. It's the part we don't see when it's displayed on a pedestal. And it's the part we don't see when it's, when it's a urinal on the wall. This is the part that's fastened to the wall. And of course, it's a sort of strange and fascinating object. So for the next Duchamp exhibition, maybe we can get two and, put one right, the correct way and the other one upside down. But here's the strange thing. It's also hanging from the ceiling. I mean, he must have put in some serious work. This is heavy. This is cast iron with enamel. Imagine taking your sink and tying it to the ceiling. I mean, this would be difficult. So serious work went into this. And this leads off into a whole nother topic that I'm not going to go into. I know that people eat lunch late in Mexico City, but I don't want this talk to go on till dinner time. But there is a whole question about not only suspension of objects, but also turning them upside down. And what does that gesture of reversing them mean? I think it's actually very important. It's something I wrote about 15 years ago in an essay, but I won't repeat it. But let's come back to the hat rack, which is the primary object here. What might this mean? So it depends. You have to have a sufficiently dirty mind to pursue this in depth, but that's a useful thing for a scholar. So I want to relate it to this later photograph by Man Ray. And here, let me be frank about, my procedure in this lecture, and a lot of my work, is to interpret things by later artists' work. As you can see, I've, interpreted Duchamp's Bride through Picabia's Bride of a few years later, and I've, shown you a Man Ray photograph, a photogram inspired, I'm arguing, by a Picabia drawing and so forth. So now I'm extending that procedure, going a little farther away in time, to Man Ray's photograph of a hat that was published in one of the surrealist journals. Well, there's an obvious visual pun here. There's a crease in the top of the hat. It's some kind of a vaginal symbol. So there's some idea about desire. This is a sexual object. The hat is a fetish. And, this fits perfectly with Freudian theory. As you recall, again, Buenos Aires, the fetish is an object that substitutes for the absent feminine phallus. Freud said that fetishists are men who, desire women, but are also kind of traumatized by the recognition that women don't have phalluses, and therefore find some other object that can be the phallic, create the phallic woman. There's a series, I didn't put them in here, of drawings by Salvador Dali of women's hats with shoes and heels, so very phallic heels. Man Ray's photograph is kind of the opposite, actually. It's showing us a feminine, a vaginal object, in effect. Well, this is the top of the hat. This is the crown of the hat. But it seems to me it's worth thinking about the other side, the inside of the crown. And here we are, once again, as with the bottle rack, with an aperture, an opening that gets filled by something. There's the hook of the hat rack that gets inserted into the hat when it supports it. So my suggestion here, and I realize this is getting a bit extreme, so feel free to say, no, that's absolute nonsense. This is what the question and answer period is for. But my suggestion is that Duchamp, at some level, thought of the hat rack as a kind of phallic object, strangely enough curved like the dard, the very late sculpture that's in the exhibition, which could go into a kind of womb-like or vaginal aperture. So that the apparently innocent action of a man coming in and putting his hat on the hat rack is in fact a sort of simulation of sexual intercourse. But notice that it's been suspended out of reach. So in a way, we're back into the realm of the bachelors, of the unconsummated sex act. And that brings me to the next photograph, which you can't see. I have to push the button, which is this very strange and wonderful photograph that Duchamp took of several ready-mades in his studio. So there's the hat rack at upper left, casting a shadow on the wall. At the lower left is the shadow of the bicycle wheel. On the lower right is the shadow of another much less well-known ready-made, and I can't even remember the name of it. The thing at upper right is actually just an electrical fixture that was in the studio. That's not by Duchamp. But in any case, we see all these shadows. So we have the ready-mades, which I've been arguing are symbols of sexual intercourse or sexual desire. They are, in their own way, desiring machines, to go back to the bicycle wheel. Now we have the shadow of desire. So I want to finish by suggesting a reinterpretation of this work. Duchamp's painting, I think his actual last painting, Tu me, from 1918. This was done for the great collector Catherine Dreyer in the United States. Duchamp was her advisor for many years and helped her form an incredibly great collection of modern art, which they called the Société Anonyme, which sounds very mysterious, the anonymous society. It's actually just the French phrase for incorporated, anonymous stockholders, but to people in the United States, it sounds very weird and sexy, so we like it. So they formed this great collection. This painting was done to fit into her library. It went on top of a bookcase. There are photographs of it, yes, as if there were a bigger, where the lights are plugged in here. And if we had time, there's, other stories that could be connected to this. Picasso, unbelievably enough, in 1911 received a commission from an American critic named Hamilton Easterfield to do a set of paintings for his library in Brooklyn. Everything hip is in Brooklyn, right? Goes back to 1911. And the commission was never fulfilled. The paintings never went to Brooklyn, but they exist. And many years ago, my teacher, William Rubin, identified which ones were supposed to be for that library. But this is a painting done for a library that actually did go to the library. So what meaning should we give to this painting? This is kind of a mystery in Duchamp's scholarship. The title is often taken, it's, not a complete phrase in French, you do something to me, but what? The verb is missing. And it's usually interpreted to be, tu m'ennuies, you bore me, you irritate me, or more colloquially, tu m'emmerdes, which is the rude way of saying you piss me off, you really irritate me. But we don't know that for a fact. And I'd like to suggest that perhaps it means something different, like tu m'excites. You make me excited, you arouse me. Notice how we see not the hat rack, but the shadow of the hat rack. We see again at the left the shadow of the bicycle wheel, as in the photograph. We see the shadow of a corkscrew. Again, oh my God, children should not be allowed to look at corkscrews. We see, which is not, in fact, a ready-made, but there's a kind of joke here. There are the actual Duchamp ready-mades, and then there's the ready-made, the painted ready-made that doesn't actually exist. Don't ask me about the colored rectangles. I don't have an explanation. But what I want to suggest is that the shadows here are the shadows of desire falling across the world. that Duchamp is saying that, we human beings, we are always buffeted by, somewhere at the back of our heads, we are always desiring this or desiring that. And that, you can't look at anything in the world. When you look out at the world, your desires are projected out onto it, and you are aroused by, you're excited by what you see, even if it's not anything there. It's just the shadow, the projection of your own desire. And so, yes, we are, as Deleuze and Guattari say, desiring machines, and perhaps we turn everything we look at into desiring machines or objects of desire, but would you really want to have it any other way? Thank you.